Peter Beinart is editor-at-large at Jewish Currents, professor of journalism and political science at CUNY's Newmark School of Journalism, and a fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He also writes the Beinart Notebook on Substack and is a frequent contributor to the New York Times. Peter, hi. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
My pleasure.
First and foremost, I know that you went through a major transformation in terms of your attitudes towards Israel and its relationship with the Palestinians. Can you describe how your thinking has changed in recent years and why?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in a very Zionist home. My parents are South African Jews, and my grandmother, who was a very big influence on me, was actually born in Egypt and then lived in the Belgian Congo and then in South Africa. She had a very strong sense of the transience and fragility of Jewish life, and for her, Israel was the one place that Jews could be safe. And I think she passed that down to me. And there was that even if you didn't live in Israel, the fact that there was one Jewish state in the wake of the Holocaust was an essential thing. And I used to travel with my father to Israel when I was a kid. My father used to work there. And I remembered the sense of just tremendous joy that both he and my grandfather took whenever they were there. You know, it used to being a small minority where there's something about being in a Jewish society and a Jewish civilization that's very, very powerful and hard to describe. I had, thoughts about things I thought Israel might be doing wrong, but I don't think they were fundamental critiques. Then I'm suddenly embarrassed to say, quite kind of late in my life, in my early 30s, I for the first time went and spent time with Palestinians in the West Bank. And it's hard to explain how shocking that experience was. In the West Bank, Palestinians live under Israeli control, but they can't become citizens of the country in which they live. They live under military law. They don't have the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. They don't have due process. They need permission to travel. And when you see what that's like, it's one thing to kind of know that in the abstract, but when you see it on the ground, I guess maybe an analogy might have been what it would have been like in America to go to Mississippi during Jim Crow. It's just shocking to see how good, decent people's lives are completely blighted by living under a state that can do virtually whatever it wants to them with no accountability. And that began for me a process of really belatedly trying to learn about what Israel and Zionism meant, not for me and my people, but what it meant for Palestinians. And I, for many years, supported the idea of a Palestinian state, because I thought that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem who lived as subjects, but not as citizens under the control of Israel, deserved citizenship in their own state, which is like the most basic, I think, of human rights. But over time, I began to believe that in fact was not possible, that given how deeply entrenched Israel was in the West Bank, that partition into a Jewish and Palestinian state was no longer possible. And also that it actually didn't address some of the more fundamental issues. And so I think in 2020 I wrote an essay in which I argued that we should think in terms of one equal state. That always sounds very radical to people when you talk about it in terms of Israel Palestine, not a Jewish state or a Christian or a Muslim or even a Palestinian state, but one equal state with equality under the law for everybody that represents the national identities of both peoples. But it's funny that we Americans consider it so radical because that's what we want here. We have been struggling with a lot of difficulty for that principle of equality under the law, irrespective of your religion, your race, or ethnicity in the United States. And so that's the same basic principle. It wouldn't look the same in every way, of course. That's the same basic principle, I believe, for Israel Palestine.
Well, that is the longest first answer I think I've ever heard, but certainly very inclusive. But we still have a lot of wood to chop here before we're done, Peter. And first and foremost, what was it like to shift your ideology and to do it so publicly as someone who's built a high-profile career as a writer and thinker on foreign affairs broadly in the Mideast issues specifically?
Well, there were certainly people who were not happy with me, including people who are very dear to me, people who I love. And I live very much inside the Jewish community. I go to an Orthodox synagogue. My children have gone to Jewish day school. So I live really in a Jewish community. And my views are are kind of on my views are not held by most people that I know, including even many in my own family. So that was difficult, and it remains difficult. On the other hand, I think it led me to a new series of relationships, particularly with Palestinians, that have been really, really deeply, deeply meaningful to me. And I suppose being the child of South Africans who, and I spent a fair amount of my childhood under apartheid, and saw how my parents and saw how other people responded to apartheid. And it is worth noting that tragically, even Israel's own human rights organizations, leading human rights organizations, now say that Israel is practicing apartheid. I think that was a lesson for me, that sometimes when you take positions that accord with your conscience, others will not agree with them. I'm very lucky that I have the freedom to take these positions. And the worst that's likely to happen to me is that some people get angry at me. I'm not going to be thrown in jail. I'm not going to be killed. So I have much, much greater privilege and freedom to have these views than many others do.
Your evolution in thinking is very much reflective of the shift we're seeing in younger people on college campuses, which is very, as you know, controversial. Tell us how, from your prism, you view this shift in sort of attitudes towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yes, there is a pretty stark generational divide, including among American Jews. And I think it has to do with a different set of life experiences. First of all, if you're younger, the only Israeli leadership you've really ever known is the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, who came to power in 2009 and with a one-year hiatus has been the prime minister ever since. So for older people who might kind of take the view that Israel really wanted to give the Palestinians a state, whether that was really ever true or not, that Israel didn't really want to be occupying these millions of people who lack basic rights. It's really hard to say that when you have a right-wing Israeli prime minister who very explicitly says, we will never support a Palestinian state. I think that's one of the things. The other thing is, Edward Said, the great Palestinian literary critic and intellectual, wrote in the 1980s that Palestinians lacked permission to narrate, which is to say they were really absent from American discussions in the media and elsewhere, even about themselves. And I think one of the things that started to happen in the past few years, and I think partly it has to do with Black Lives Matter, and partly it has to do with Me Too, is there was a greater awareness in the media and other places that Palestinians should not only be spoken about, but should be allowed to speak for themselves. And that, I think, has had a really big impact on younger people, listening to Palestinians talk about the realities of their own lives.
Having said that, you have acknowledged being jarred by some of the language of the left following October 7th. What language specifically did you find jarring and why?
I think there have been some folks on the left, some on campus, some not on campus, who have either, at the most extreme, kind of justified Hamas's horrifying attacks on October 7th, or if not justified it, essentially said it's not Hamas's fault by saying Israel is to blame for this because Israel created the context of oppression that Hamas responded to. Now, I do believe that Israel has created a context of very profound oppression. The Gaza Strip was declared unlivable by the United Nations in 2017. Human Rights Watch calls it an open-air prison. But this is really important for me. People still fundamentally have moral responsibility for what they do. So even if you are suffering oppression, it does not mean that you have the right to take civilian life. That must be a red line morally, and legally. It's a war crime under international law, no matter what you've gone through. And so, yes, it did disturb me that there were some folks on the pro-Palestinian left who seemed to be unwilling to clearly make that claim about moral responsibility that Hamas bears for what happened on October 7th.
Well, let's talk about your reaction to that day and the events, horrific events that unfolded.
It was truly surreal, partly because the event happened on a Saturday morning, which is Shabbat, when I'm not on electronics, and many of the people in my community are not on electronics. And the following day, Sunday, was a Jewish holiday, and we were also not on electronics. So we were not actually on the electronic devices that we would communicate until Sunday night, right? Which was also then a day and a half after this horrifying, even bizarrely because of the Jewish calendar. People in Israel were on electronic devices on Sunday, but people in Jews in the United States, observant Jews, were not. So the news was trickling in a very odd almost surreal way. And it was also, the holiday was Simchas Torah, which is one of the most joyous of Jewish holidays. So here we were, knowing something horrifying had happened, not knowing the act details, in a moment of when we were supposed to be expressing joy. I don't think I've ever, and I pray I will never have an experience like that again. Since then, once the news, I started to get a better sense of the news. I just was overwhelmed by the magnitude. The magnitude was like of a scale that I couldn't get my head around, because when Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier, one Israeli soldier, was taken captive, we all knew his name. His picture was everywhere in the Jewish institutions of New York, my kids, Jewish skate schools, synagogues. That was one person. We all focused on him. The idea of 250 odd hostages simply overwhelmed the system. The number of dead. And then Israel started to respond in ways that took the lives of so many people in Gaza. I still feel, honestly, it was very difficult for me to sleep for a long time. I was so concerned about friends and family in Israel, and also some in Gaza. And I'm still honestly struggling to kind of feel any sense of normalcy. And it certainly is not normalcy in Israel or in Gaza.
Well, before we talk about the Israeli response to the attack of October 7th, following that attack, you've said that quite a few people invited you to think about what you might have gotten wrong about your criticism of Israel. And I'm curious if an event of this magnitude did cause some reflexive level of introspection or rethinking of your position.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a process that's still ongoing. I mean, I have someone who, for better or for worse, have changed my mind about a variety of different things over the course of my adult life, and I've tried, as new information comes in, to be willing to kind of reckon publicly with that. I think that I am struggling to make sense, to understand how to reconcile different truths. The one truth is, which I knew already, but has been emphasized in the most horrifying way, is that Hamas is an organization that is willing to use violence in a way that has no respect for human life, and has an Islamist ideology that is fundamentally contrary to the liberal democratic values that I believe in. I knew this intellectually already, but it has been made clear in the most graphic and most profound ways. And so I've been so this is something I think I will be writing about and wrestling with for a long time. The question, though, where I think I probably am still going to come down in a very different place than some others in the Jewish community, is about what the right answer to this is. Because I fundamentally believe that if Palestinians are oppressed, like any group of people who are oppressed, they're going to fight for their freedom. So to me, one of the key lessons of the horror of October 7th is we need to strengthen and support Palestinians who are fighting for freedom ethically, fighting for freedom in a way that abides by international law. And I think one of the things that we really need to think about is the way that the United States and Israel have actually weakened Palestinians who have fought for freedom ethically, and actually by weakening them and delegitimizing them and defeating them, have actually strengthened people like Hamas who resist in unethical, immoral ways.
Can you be more specific how you believe the U.S. and Israel has weakened fair-minded Palestinians?
Well, sure. So Palestinians have been doing a number of things. First of all, you had the Palestinian Authority. At the end of the Second Intifada, starting around 2005, they started to do quite effective security cooperation with Israel. So in the West Bank, you have Mahmoud Abbas and his prime minister for a time, Salam Fayyad, saying, we're going to work with Israel to ensure that there is not violence against Israelis in the West Bank, which is an amazing thing to do when you think about it, given that they are working with the government that is denying their people rights to keep those people safe. The African National Congress under Nelson Mandela never did anything like that. The IRA didn't, but their bet was, if we show Israelis that we can keep Israelis safe, maybe they will trust us to have our own state. Instead, Israel continued the settlement growth that moved Palestinians further and further away from a state. So Salam Fayyad, who was a prime minister that many Israelis and American Jews really admired, he said in 2013 to Roger Cohen of the New York Times, we were defeated by Israel because we couldn't stop settlement growth and we looked like chumps, essentially. I'm paraphrasing. Other Palestinians went to the International Criminal Court, the United Nations. These are nonviolent efforts to ask Israel to abide by international law. What did the US do? It vetoed resolution after resolution at the UN. It shut down any possibility of an investigation from the International Criminal Court, even as we're asking the ICC to get involved in Ukraine. Other Palestinians called for boycotts and divestments and sanctions, specifically modeled on the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. I'm not saying that you have to support all of these efforts. You may agree with some and disagree, but if you oppose all of them, and in fact move to criminalize them, as many American politicians have done, to basically criminalize supporting boycotts of Israel, what do you think is going to happen? You think Palestinians say, oh, too bad, that didn't work, we're just going to basically accept living without basic rights for our entire lives? No, Palestinians will try other things, much worse and more immoral things. And that's why I think we have to think about how we responded when Palestinians fought for their freedom ethically.
You've also said that you fear sometimes that terms like decolonization take on a meaning that obscures the preciousness of life. That's a quote. Talk about the use of language and the way that so many terms like genocide and Zionism have been leveraged by both sides, in your view, in this ongoing conflict.
So all of these terms are really contested. I think that let's take a term like decolonization, right? Which is a term that's considered very alienating to many American Jews and many American politicians. But because it asserts that Zionism was a colonial movement. But in many ways, Zionism was a colonial movement. It wasn't only a colonial movement. It was many things. It was a movement of Jewish liberation, a movement of Jewish refuge. Jews have deep, deep historical ties to what we call Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And yet, this political Zionism, which emerged in the late 19th century, was also a movement led by Europeans who had very typically European ideas about what they wanted to do in a part of in the Middle East. And in fact, people like Theodor Herzl and Vladimir Jabotinsky, the leader of revisionist Zionism, used the word colonist about themselves. It was actually considered a positive term. They were going to bring civilization, modernity, and that movement ended up dispossessing Palestinian Arabs who lived there, just as other settler colonial movements have done so. So to me, I think what we need to do is try to not have such a knee-jerk reaction and try to have more, to learn more about these terms. Now, if you say you want decolonization, the question to me is, what kind of decolonization? South Africa is a certain kind of decolonization in process, right? It's a system where only one group had human rights. It was a white supremacy. And it's now a place where everyone has equality. That's the kind of decolonization I would like. If by decolonization you mean Algeria, where the French settlers in Algeria were forced out, essentially expelled from the country, then I'm not on your team. That, I think, is fundamentally wrong for the situation and fundamentally immoral. So we need to actually try to understand these terms and then ask people what they mean by them. But we shouldn't be criminalizing them or telling people that if they use them on Twitter, they're going to be banned, as Elon Musk has done.
I know that you say your views are still evolving, but do you still believe in a one-state solution with Palestinians and Israelis living side by side within the same borders? Or do you think a two-state solution? What is your thinking right now?
I still believe in the principle. I still believe that partition is not possible, and so our fundamental choices are between different kinds of one state. And it's funny, people have said to me, how could you possibly support one equal state? Wasn't this proven to be a failure on October 7th? But October 7th did not happen in the context of one equal state. Precisely the opposite. It happened in the context of one apartheid state, of one state in which Palestinians lack basic rights, especially in the West Bank, where they live under military law, and in Gaza, where they live under blockade. If there's anything, it seems to me, that October 7th proved, it's the fact that this kind of unjust, supremacist one state is not only bad for Palestinians, but ultimately it doesn't keep Israeli Jews safe. I know a lot of people think these arguments are really strange, but Fundamentally, what we know from other circumstances, from South Africa, from Northern Ireland, is that when you give people the vote, when they have a right to express themselves in government, their likelihood of using violence goes down, because most people don't want to kill or be killed. They would much rather have government be responsive to them through nonviolent means. Let's do this experiment in our head. Imagine America had not given Black people civil rights in the 1960s, that Black people had not gotten the right to participate equally. What do we think would have happened? What would have the course of race relations been in the United States? It would have been much more violent. It was the fact that people got the franchise that gave people a chance to participate nonviolently. That same principle as the one that I believe is right for Israel Palestine.
Well, let's talk about the role Hamas plays in this scenario. If in fact Hamas can never be destroyed, it can perhaps be degraded, and it may reconstitute itself, perhaps propelled by Israel's reaction to the October 7th attacks. If Hamas is intent upon not only destroying Israel, but killing all Jews worldwide, how do you square this with the idea of everyone living happily in one country?
So Hamas's first charter in 1987 was clearly an anti-Semitic document. Its second charter in 2017, if you read, certainly does not say anything about killing Jews worldwide. I'm not saying this to in any way suggest that I view Hamas's actions as anything but beneath contempt. But to be clear, Hamas's focus has always been in Israel Palestine. It's not a transnational organization like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which does attacks all over the world. It's a nationalist. It's an Islamist nationalist organization. It's also important.
So let's even remove this idea of killing Jews worldwide, but intent on destroying the state of Israel and refusing it has a right to exist.
Right. Hamas does not support the existence of a Jewish state. It's important to remember that Palestinians have been fighting against Israel, including, tragically, using violence against civilians since long before there was a Hamas. If you think about the attacks of the 1970s, airplane hijackings, the 1917 Munich massacre, the attack in Ma'alot, none of those were done by Hamas or even Islamists, because Hamas didn't exist. It was only created in 1987. Those were actually done by nationalist and leftist Palestinian parties. The reason I'm saying all this is we need to think in a larger historical context. If you want, it's not only Hamas that could use violence against Israeli civilians. It could be some other Palestinian political party that had some different ideological orientation. If you want to undermine Palestinians who use violence against civilians, fundamentally, it seems to me, you have to give Palestinians hope that there are nonviolent paths to freedom. And as I said, I believe that ultimately the likelihood of violence by any group, whether it's Hamas or some other Palestinian group, because remember, Fatah also was involved in violence against civilians, the nationalist organization during the Second Intifada, is substantially impacted by how much violence is inflicted on Palestinians, right? When we think about Palestinian violence, we also have to think about the violence that Palestinians experience, not because that justifies a single thing that Hamas did, but because if we want everyone to be safe, we have to recognize that everyone's safety is intertwined and everyone's freedom is intertwined. And that's why I ultimately believe that a situation in which everyone is free and everyone has a voice in government is an environment in which both Jews as well as Palestinians will be more safe.
How is the current situation in Gaza, the response to the attacks by the IDF, how is that impacting your wish for what Israel and Gaza and the West Bank could potentially become?
We're very, very far away from the kind of vision that I'm talking about. But it's also important to remember that history takes unexpected turns, right? There were, I know firsthand, as late as the late 1980s, very, very few white South Africans could have imagined that apartheid would end in 1994. If you told most Americans in the 1940s that within it, or even the 50s, within a generation, that we would have an army where white soldiers were taking orders from Black officers, they would have thought that was really hard to imagine. We are now on a very, very frightening trajectory. because the massive catastrophic destruction of Gaza is going to not only is going to create a situation in which I believe, which will reverberate for a long time to come, and I believe ultimately, and I say this with great trembling, make Israeli Jews less safe. Because we know that Hamas recruits from the families of people Israel has killed. You think about the number of now potential new people who may be willing to take revenge against Israel. That is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night. The other thing that keeps me up at night is the possibility of an act of mass expulsion. Israel was created with an act of by expelling more than half of the Palestinians who lived there between 1947 and 1949. Israel has already forced 80% of the people in Gaza to leave their homes. Just think about that for a second. In Ukraine, where we're rightly outraged by what Russia has done, 25% of people have been displaced. It's already 80% in Gaza. Northern Gaza has been reduced to rubble, and now Israel is going into the southern part. This is a human rights catastrophe that will have consequences for Israel and Israelis and Palestinians and for the entire world that really, really terrify me. So we're very, very far away from the vision that I would like, but in my religious tradition, you don't struggle for things because you're optimistic that they're going to happen anytime soon. You struggle for what you believe because you have a moral and a religious obligation to do the right thing. And what ultimately ends up happening is ultimately out of your hands. You only play your role.
And you have given up on the idea of a two-state solution completely?
Look, if I'm proven wrong, and there is the creation of a sovereign, contiguous, viable Palestinian state, and it's supported by Palestinians and Israelis through a legitimate process, certainly it would not be for me to second guess that, right? If Palestinians and Israelis both legitimately decide on that. I just think that the people who are closest to the ground think, and have convinced me that that is no longer possible. I mean, just to give you a sense of this, there was a column written in the New York Times about the possibility of a two-state solution called 5 Minutes to Midnight by the late columnist Anthony Lewis, based on interviews with the deputy mayor of Jerusalem. They warned that there may soon be 100,000 settlers in the West Bank, and it would be therefore impossible to create a Palestinian state. That column was written in 1982. We now have close to roughly 700,000 settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So no, I don't think that's possible. But again, if I'm proven wrong, I'd be very happy to be proven wrong.
I talked to Richard Haas not too long ago, who I'm sure you know, and he said some political overtures needed to be made by Israel in the form of reducing settlements or pulling back on settlements in the West Bank. Do you agree that that would be an appropriate or a helpful gesture? And what do you think is the likelihood of that ever happening?
Yes, I think that would be valuable. Again, you could start with some of the settlements deep in the West Bank from which settlers are regularly terrorizing Palestinians and indeed ethnically cleansing parts of what's called Area C of the West Bank by forcing Palestinians out of their entire villages to leave. The chances of that happening under this Israeli government are zero. This is an Israeli government that is deeply, deeply devoted to not just maintaining the settlement project, but to expanding it at a rate we've never seen before. Now, there probably at some point when this war ends, which I hope is as soon as possible, there may be elections in Israel, and it's possible there could be a very different kind of government because Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party are very unpopular now. I don't think that on its own that will take the form of a government that really is willing to challenge settlers much at all, but perhaps with some fundamentally different U.S. policy, maybe you could move Israel in that direction.
Speaking of the United States, you argue that the U.S. has allowed Israel to act with impunity going back for decades. How do you believe the U.S. has been complicit in Israel's misdeeds, what you believe are Israel's misdeeds against Palestinians?
Well, first of all, we give Israel roughly $3.8 billion of essentially unconditional military aid. I mean, now we're giving more to Ukraine, but generally over the past decades, the country that's by far gotten the most military aid is Israel. Now, we are supposed to have a law on the books in the United States called the Leahy Law. What the Leahy Law says is that it's illegal for the United States to give weapons to the unit of any military, a unit of any military that has been found of committing human rights abuses. But in the case of Israel, we don't even track the data to know if that would be relevant here, right? So that's one way. I mean, it's not theoretical, abstract. In Gaza, in many cases, these are our weapons, right? And we are not even following our own law about knowing whether it's lawful for us to be selling those weapons if Israel is committing human rights abuses. Secondly, we use our diplomatic influence at the International Criminal Court, at the United Nations, other international bodies, to essentially make sure that international law is never enforced vis-a-vis Israel. This is one of the reasons that so many people around the world, especially in the global South, see the United States as so hypocritical. And frankly, it really undermines our efforts in Ukraine. Because when the US goes to people and says, you know what Russia's doing is terrible, which it is, we want you to take a tough stand because we believe in what Antony Blinken likes to call the rules-based international order, and we believe in human rights. People in the global South say, no, you don't. What do you mean? You think we're taking you seriously? Look at your policy vis-a-vis Israel. Not only Israel, of course, and I think this is the one way. It doesn't start with Joe Biden. It goes back for many decades. The last U.S. president who was willing to condition U.S. aid towards Israel in any meaningful way was George H.W. Bush in the early 1990s. It's been that long.
Peter, you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th. I interviewed former Ambassador Dennis Ross about this and about criticism of Israel's reaction to October 7th and the attacks that they have now launched on Gaza. And he said, what is the alternative? So let me ask you the same question. What is the alternative?
So the reason I don't support this, and then I'll talk about the alternative, is that Israel doesn't have any answer for what it does after it destroys Hamas. Its answers are, if anything, even worse than the kind of answers that American officials gave on the eve of the war in Iraq. Israel, if it tries to run Gaza or put in charge anyone else in Gaza, will face an insurgency of the kind similar to what we face in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it will not make Israel look strong or competent. It will not solve Israel's security problems. What would I do? I would negotiate a long-term ceasefire as part of a deal.
But what would you have done after the
attack? After the attacks, yes. I would do what the United States did not do after 9/11. I would have a very narrowly targeted military response on the people who masterminded the attack. Then I would negotiate.
Sorry to interrupt, but how do you do that if the people who mastermind the attack actually are integrated among the civilian population?
It may take many years for Israel to actually get to those people. Israel may have to be very, very patient. It has done that. It has been willing to be very, very patient in the case of other people who have led terrorist attacks in previous decades. I would negotiate a long-term ceasefire as part of a deal to release all of the hostages who were in Gaza. And then I would begin to weaken Hamas politically by strengthening Palestinians who have a different vision. The most popular Palestinian leader is Marwan Barghouti. He's been in jail for more than 20 years now. He's not an Islamist. He's more popular than Hamas. He's talked about reconciliation in the tradition of Nelson Mandela. I would let him and people like him out of jail. I would then begin withdrawing settlements deep in the West Bank. I would say there would be no normalization with Saudi Arabia absent Palestinian freedom. I would reaffirm the status quo on the Temple Mount. All of these would begin to change Palestinian politics. Some Palestinian leaders have said that if Hamas agreed to disarm, Hamas could be brought into the Palestine Liberation Organization, the umbrella organization for all Palestinian political parties. That organization needs to be revived so there can be legitimate Palestinian leadership that can chart a path for Palestinians and even move towards negotiations for Israel. So those are some of the things that I would do.
You said earlier, Peter, that some people in your own family and others really disagree with your positions on this.
Sure.
What is their argument against what you're saying to me today?
I mean, at a fundamental level, their view, I think, would be that Jews can never fundamentally be safe without a state, without a state that privileges us over Palestinians, that it is only a Jewish state that fundamentally provides Jews security in a dangerous world, and that an organization like Hamas can only be defeated, or at least must be defeated militarily, before essentially one can talk about anything else. I would simply say that my views don't come out of nowhere. The fundamental reason that my views have evolved in the way they do is the fact that I spend a lot of time talking and listening to Palestinians. It's something I do on a kind of continuous basis. And I think one of the things that worries me about my community very often, our institutions, is that people talk about Palestinians all the time. We're always talking about Palestinians, why they behave the way they do, what they do, how they think, how they'll react. And yet in the organized American Jewish community, it's extremely rare to listen to Palestinians. And that seems to me a fundamental problem, that so many of the people who express strong opinions about Palestinians are not actually listening to Palestinians talk for themselves. And what I hear from Palestinians again and again and again and again is, if you want Israeli Jews to be safe, then Palestinians must be safe. If you want Israeli Jews to be safe, Palestinians need a horizon for freedom. And that has been what has influenced my own views.
What is your current outlook when it comes to this situation, Peter? Are you optimistic at all, pessimistic, somewhere in the middle? Do you have any hope that this decades-long conflict will ever be resolved?
So in Jewish tradition, there's a very stark divide between optimism and hope. Optimism is the belief that you think things will go well. Hope is the moral imperative to maintain the possibility that they could, because it makes you act in a certain way. So no, I am not optimistic at all. In fact, I think we face a very real possibility of another act of mass expulsion, an act that we will be judged by future generations for decades to come. I think that is an entirely real possibility.
Mass expulsion of Palestinians
from the Gaza Strip. There's been a lot of reporting that Israel would like Egypt to open its borders, so it can force Palestinians to move into Egypt. And if they did, I think it's quite unlikely that they would be allowed to come back. That's certainly the view of significant elements of this Israeli government. And I would really urge you and other people in the media to, when you talk to U.S. government officials and politicians, specifically ask them, would they be willing, are they clear in their opposition to this? But for me, hope is about the moral obligation to try to act in the spirit of a religious tradition, Judaism, which says that human dignity and human life are infinitely precious. The Talmud says that you can override, the imperatives of human dignity override any rabbinic command. So it seems to me it's in that principle that I try to, in my very, very flawed and kind of fallible, small way, I try to act, and I hope that history somehow will bring about a better day, but it doesn't mean that I think I'll necessarily see it.
On that note, Peter Beinart, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.